This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now, July 2020 may well be remembered as the month the US-China relationship took a very sharp turn for the worse. We have had a string of tit-for-tat actions since the Trump administration very early identified China as a strategic competitor. Of course, these included tariffs, which one could argue successfully brought China to the table to sign the Phase 1 trade deal, which still holds. But Congress has been targeting China with a series of bills, and the Trump administration has also taken a string of actions, including in July, closing China's consulate in Houston, calling it basically a den of spies. Of course, China quite expectedly retaliated by closing the US consulate in Chengdu. Then we had Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivering a pretty strong speech against China. So the momentum has lately been building. The only question, of course there are many, but the big question is this as bad as it gets, or is it going to get worse? With the COVID-19 pandemic piled on top of this, China is front and center of this year's presidential campaign here as well, certainly as far as Donald Trump is concerned. To help us focus on what may lie ahead, we have on the line today Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, here in DC. And joining us also from DC is Yun Sun, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. Thank you both for joining me this evening. I really appreciate it. It's a busy time for all of us, although we are also stuck at home.
Thanks for having me.
It may be a good idea for me to start. It may be a good idea for me to start with citing what Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in a speech at the Atlantic Council this week. He said, of course, from Singapore's perspective, that he hoped China and the US would find stability in their relationship. Now, Bonnie, given that the issue of China has assumed so much prominence, what is your prognosis? Do you see the relationship settling into some sort of stability going forward?
No, I actually don't anticipate that we will see stability. We still have several months before the presidential elections in early November. And I think that the Trump administration is likely to take more actions against China. First of all, the president himself is no longer concerned, it seems, about harming his relationship with Xi Jinping or undermining new trade negotiations. So he's really taken the gloves off. In addition, there is an election factor at play, because American attitudes have turned sharply negatively against China. And therefore, I think that the Trump campaign strategists think that it's a good way to win votes by really bashing China and taking actions against Beijing. And then I think there's another factor that's even more worrisome. Secretary of State Pompeo and other U.S. officials in the administration really want to ensure that the focus of geopolitical systemic competition between the U.S. and China survives this administration. And so if Trump loses and Vice President Biden wins, they want to ensure that interdependence is unraveled, that there is a permanent downturn in the U.S.-China relationship that can't be easily reversed in a new presidency. So I think we really are likely to see some continued negative developments in the U.S.-China relationship going forward.
Yun, what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, when I look at it from the Chinese perspective and what the Chinese calculation has been, they are genuinely seeing this as not a temporary event. That even with the change of administration, they believe this bipartisan consensus will survive. And the next administration, regardless of whether it's a Trump 2 or a Biden administration, it will have to continue some of the current policy or some of the trends. And this has raised a lot of, anxieties, I would say, on the Chinese side. But unfortunately, I have to say that on this issue, on this escalation of tension between US and China, China is is not that innocent. There's no inflection, there's no reflection about what the Chinese assertive foreign policy has created, basically in the past decade. So in a sense, when the Chinese finger point the U.S. policy or the downturn of the bilateral relations totally on election politics or on the Trump administration. I think that is also not addressing the real question here, which is that the Chinese actions and the Chinese behaviors also need a lot of reflection.
Now, as you both have mentioned, we are less than 100 days from the November 3rd election, and this is going to be a more momentous election than most because there is so much at stake, not just for America, of course, but for the world, really. Bonnie, you touched on this briefly, but what can we expect from a second Trump administration should he win re-election? And conversely, what can we expect from a Joe Biden administration should he win? I mean, of course, the Biden campaign has already said it will re-engage in multilateral institutions and agreements. For example, it'll return to the Paris agreement on climate change. And it has said it will reinforce relations with US allies rather than go at it unilaterally. But what should we expect vis-a-vis China and more broadly Asia? I know that's a big question, but if you could address that, Bonnie.
Well, it is a big question. In the next few months, as I said, I think that this will be the most dangerous period in the US-China relationship. So in other words, if Donald Trump is reelected, I think that he will try to lower friction between the US and China. He will want to resume the trade negotiations. He will probably try to reestablish and improve once again his personal relationship with Xi Jinping. So I don't think that what we're seeing today would necessarily go on in a second Trump administration. If Vice President Biden wins, I think that we will see some continuation of policies. First of all, Biden would inherit things like the tariffs. He would inherit some of these sanctions against Chinese officials. So he would not easily undo these policies. And in fact, he might try to use the tariffs as leverage in negotiations with China in order to get them lifted. What is Beijing willing to do? But I think that Biden would pursue smart competition. I think there would be more consistency in policy toward China than we have seen under the Trump administration. I don't think that there would be an ideological emphasis. What we've heard from, for example, Secretary of State Pompeo calling for the people of China, that we should empower them and get them perhaps to stand up to their party and maybe even overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. I just don't think that would be part of a Biden administration policy. I think that the Biden administration would be focused on really trying to change what is objectionable in Chinese behavior. I also think we'd see more dialogue mechanisms, so more negotiations aimed at addressing problems as well as managing problems, not driving the relationship to greater confrontation and potential conflict. And then finally, of course, working more closely with allies and partners, so a less unilateralist policy. But there certainly is belief in the Biden administration that if we are going to successfully change China's behavior, we can't do it alone. We have to work with other countries around the world.
Right. Yoon, the same questions to you essentially. What are your thoughts on what we should expect from either of these two dispensations after November 3rd? And a quick reference also to what I think one of you mentioned earlier about public opinion. In the States, it has turned pretty much anti-Chinese. I mean, all the surveys show that. And in fact, nationalist Chinese opinion has hardened in China as well. So do you also anticipate some kind of, deal-making, cooling off going forward, Yoon?
I think that's a great question. I think one theme that will remain unchanged, regardless of who wins in the election, is that there is not a consensus here in the United States among national security strategists that China is a threat. So I don't think that is going to change, even with a Biden presidency. But what will change is, I would agree with Bonnie, it would be the format, the style, and how a Biden administration will seek to address that problem. But instead of confrontation and the escalation of tension as we are seeing today, I think the Biden administration will use a much multi-layered and diverse group of instruments to try to shape China's behavior. What does worry me, however, is that, like you pointed out, the public opinion in China is turning extremely hawkish towards the United States. Partially, that is a creation by Beijing. That the Chinese government has manipulated the information to create that hawkish public opinion, to show the outside world that we have the support of our people. But on the other hand, that's also going to create obstacles when, say, hypothetically, when there's a Biden administration next year, then there is a possibility that the hawks and the hardliners in China could see that as an exploitable opportunity. So I think that will be a true disaster, and I hope it doesn't happen.
Yun, staying with you for a moment, is it fair to say that part of Donald Trump's legacy, should he lose, is that allies may not so readily take the United States for granted? And, you know, the Trump administration this year has been talking about, you know, more burden sharing in South Korea, and it's withdrawing troops from Germany, for example. So there's this sort of perception, I mean, going beyond the China issue, there's a perception in Southeast Asia in general that the US may not be such a reliable partner after all. We should not take the US for granted. What are your thoughts on that, Yun?
On that, I agree with what Bonnie said, that if the United States wants to counter China, wants to deal with the China's threat, then they cannot go about it alone. It needs the support from its allies and its partners to counterbalance China and to shape China's behavior. This needs to be a collective effort. If the United States decides to pursue a unilateral approach towards China, I think that's going to be quite unwise.
Okay, Bonnie, last word from you on that. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about going forward? I mean, I know you said that, you know, it's a very risky period now, in the next 3-4 months, but what is your feeling?
Well, I am worried about a potential series of U.S. actions. We could see the Trump administration try to reduce the number of Chinese diplomats in the United States, close more consulates, perhaps even try to shut down all the Confucius Institutes and United Front operations that are in the United States, maybe impose sanctions on China, for example, for aiding North Korea to circumvent sanctions, as there is growing evidence that China is providing assistance to North Korea to get hard currency. It's really a very long list of things that the U.S. could do. The recent change in the policy on the South China Sea to bring it more in line with the July 2016 ruling also opens the door for the United States to take actions against China, both tougher rhetorical actions as well as potential sanctions or actions on the water with law enforcement or even Navy ships that could potentially cause an accident. So I worry about increased military activity, especially as there's limited real dialogue between the United States and China in this period. Both sides are really using their militaries to signal each other and to demonstrate resolve. And so we see a lot of military activity going on, both in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. So these areas really are quite dangerous. And there is a need, I think, for both countries to get back to the actual dialogue table and to find ways to manage and control their differences before we end up in the kind of crisis that we had in 2001, when we actually, of course, had a Chinese fighter jet collide with a U.S. reconnaissance plane. The Chinese pilot lost his life, and the United States plane landed in Hainan, and we ended up with a major political crisis.
What are your thoughts on the risks going forward on the ground, or in this case, actually in the water? I mean, is there a risk of an accident, as Bonnie said, and, you know, something turning kinetic, which the two countries will be really challenged to control?
This is a great question. This is a question that the Chinese have been debating about, and whether whether it's going to be a real accident or it's going to be a deliberate accident, given what they see as systematic escalation. So I think it is possible to have little skirmishes, but with the type of skirmishes to escalate, that will not be accidental. That will have to be deliberate.
Okay, Yun-Sun, Bonnie, Glaser, thank you so much again for being with us today on Asian Insider.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So the US-China relationship is clearly at a very critical juncture and will be carefully watched over the next 3 to 4 months in particular, because we are contending with the presidential election campaign in the US. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.